And then you can make it live whenever you're ready to open it up to everyone.
Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and start it now. Hi, good evening, everyone. We're going to go ahead and give a couple of minutes for folks to get logged in so we can get started. We'll give about 3 minutes for folks to come in. If you have any questions as you're arriving, I want to encourage folks to type your questions into the Q&A box. You can see that right at the bottom of your screen. And you can ask questions to myself. You can ask questions to Susan Lynn, who is our representative for the City of Alhambra from the Housing Rights Center. So we'll go ahead and leave about 2 more minutes just so folks can jump on, then we'll go ahead and get started. Great, so seeing as it's 6:07, we will go ahead and get started. I'm now going to turn over our time to Susan Lynn from the Housing Rights Center. Susan Lynn is also our representative for the City of Alhambra, so she's an important person to know over at HRC. So Susan, if you can go ahead and take it away for us.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. Thanks so much for introducing me. And so I'm from the Housing Rights Center, and today we are going to talk about COVID-19 and fair housing. We're going to talk about rental protections. We're going to talk about evictions and also discrimination in housing and a few more other topics. So I'm going to go ahead and give a brief overview of what we're going to talk about. We're first going to talk about who we are. Then we're going to talk about rent and evictions and housing. Then we're going to talk about fair housing, or like what discrimination looks like in housing. And then lastly, we'll have time for any questions that you all may have for me. So the Housing Rights Center, if you're not familiar with our services, we were founded in 1968 when Congress passed the Fair Housing Act, and we're the nation's largest nonprofit civil rights organization dedicated to fair housing. We serve LA County and Ventura County, and our services are available in many different languages. So specifically for Alhambra, I am the representative. So if you have any questions, usually before the pandemic, we would actually have a clinic in Alhambra in person. But currently, due to the pandemic, you can access our services by emailing us or calling us, make an appointment to speak to me or another counselor about any questions that you may have. So we have a variety of free services. So first we have our housing rights hotline. That's basically a 1-800 phone number. You see that phone number on the screen that you can call to speak to a housing counselor about any type of housing questions that you may have, whether it's about evictions, rental increases, security deposits, what's going on with the new housing laws, etc. You can also make an appointment to speak to us on our website, housingrightcenter.org. And then here are the different things that the services that we offer to those who call us. So we offer an investigation for discrimination cases. That's one of our main services. So say a tenant calls us and says that they feel like they're being discriminated against or treated unfairly based on things like their race, whether they have kids, their disability, etc. We are one of those public agencies that would be able to investigate that case for free. We also have a litigation department, meaning we do have staff attorneys that take some of our discrimination cases to court. And then we have an outreach and education department, which is the department I'm part of. And we offer a variety of different educational services for the community. These services include things like this workshop that you are attending now. And then we also have something called Project Place. That's a rental listing that lists affordable housing, senior housing, veteran housing for LA County and Ventura County. If you're interested in Project Place, you can access it by emailing us or just going on our website, housingrightcenter.org. This listing is updated monthly. So we do have a variety of free online events due to the nature of shelter in place right now. We've added a plethora of online ways that you can learn about fair housing and also get the help that you need. So on Mondays, we have a live Facebook Q&A. You can just find us Housing Rights Center on Facebook. And then on Tuesdays and Thursdays, we have a workshop similar to the one you're attending now. On Tuesdays, we have a general housing rights workshop that's in English. And on Thursdays, we have one in Spanish. On Fridays, we have a webinar specifically about COVID-19 topics. As the nature of the legislation has been changing month by month, these webinars are important to tune into if you just want to keep updated with, what are our protections now? Have they changed? Have they expired, etc. You can find all of this information on our website, housingrightcenter.org. So let's get right to it. So we're going to talk about rent increases during COVID-19. So what you have to know for rent increases is that there are certain areas of the county, certain cities in the county that have local rent freezes specifically for rent stabilized homes. So this doesn't apply to Alhambra, but just to illustrate, unincorporated LA County units that are under rent stabilization or are under the rent control for unincorporated LA County, they do have a rent freeze right now, and rent freeze means that the rent cannot be increased at all. The city of Los Angeles, units in the city of Los Angeles that are under RSO are also having a rent freeze. And then units under the Baldwin Park RSO also have a rent freeze at the time. Like I said, this doesn't apply to Alhambra, but there are, just to illustrate, different parts of the county, specific cities that have frozen the rents, meaning the rent cannot go up in these areas. If you don't live in one of these areas, for example, live in the city of Alhambra and you want to know, how much can my landlord increase the rent right now? I'm about to answer that question. So if you live in the city of Alhambra, rent increases will be dictated by a law called AB 1482. This passed in 2019. AB 1482 is a statewide bill that limits the amount that landlords can increase the rent per year. And there are certain types of units that are covered under AB 1482. So if you're listening to this right now and you're like, well, I live in the city of Alhambra, am I covered under this statewide rent cap? You are covered if you live in an apartment complex that's over 15 years old, if you live in a single family home or a condo that's owned by a corporation, and if you live in a duplex where the owner does not live there. You're not covered, well, if you already have a local rent control. Like I said, Alhambra doesn't have one, so you don't have to worry about it. You're not covered if you live in an affordable housing unit in the city of Alhambra. You're not covered if you live in a dormitory in the city of Alhambra. And basically what this law does is that it establishes a rent cap for the covered units that I spoke about. And the rent cap is 5% per year, plus the change in cost of living. It's also called inflation, or up to 10%, whichever is lower. That means in the LA metropolitan area, landlords can't increase the rent more than 5.7% per year. And this is not per month, it's a total per year. So this means that landlords can increase the rent multiple times a year, but the total amount that they increase the rent can't exceed this allowed percentage. Those are for covered units under AB 1482. If you're listening to this and you live in an affordable housing unit, or if you live in a dormitory in the city of Alhambra, there is still a limit to how much landlords can increase the rent, but that's 10%. Rather than a lower 5 to 8% if you're living in a covered unit. So right now, because of the pandemic, sorry, the state of California has a rent cap for everybody. And that rent cap is 10%. Landlords in a state of emergency in California cannot increase the rent over 10%. If they do so, they can be charged with a misdemeanor. Let's talk about eviction protections during COVID-19. So there is a state law that protects tenants from being evicted due to COVID-19 related reasons. At this point, I'm assuming a lot of people have heard about this protection and know that they have that they can defer their rent, or that they are protected against eviction during this time because of COVID-19. To defer their rent, tenants have to take specific steps. They have to, number one, have a reason related to COVID-19. They have to provide their landlord with a signed statement of financial distress or issues related to COVID-19. And then lastly, they do have to pay their deferred rent over time. So the state law doesn't necessarily say that tenants don't have to pay rent. It just gives tenants the ability to basically push that rental payment later on, and gives tenants the ability to repay that debt over time. These are some example reasons that tenants would defer their rent: lost income due to COVID-19, childcare expenses, medical expenses, and many other potential impacts of COVID-19. If you're looking for the paperwork to give your landlord because you need to defer rent, you can find it on housingiskey.com, or you can go to novrent.org, which will create and send free letters to your landlord. So here's the rough timeline for repaying the rental debt that tenants owe. So by the end of June, tenants have to pay at least 25% of the total rent that they owe from between September 2020 to the end of June 30th, the end of June 2021. So this means that whatever the lump sum is that tenants owe between these months, they only have to pay 25% of that in order to not be evicted by the end of June. And then starting in July, tenants do have to resume their monthly rental payments, meaning that whatever rent is owed in July, you have to pay that full rent amount. You can't defer it anymore under the law. And then on August 1st, tenants do have to start paying back whatever rent that they have owed, maybe ever since March 2020. So this doesn't mean that tenants have to pay back all the rent right away. It just means that they have to make some type of plan or give some type of indication to their landlord that they are planning now to start paying back their rent debt. And there are due date for the total rent debt may vary city by city, but if there's not a specific date for the city, then the rent has to be paid back, or all the rent debt that is owed from the tenant has to be paid back by August 31st, 2022. And then landlords have the ability to sue in small claims court, not evict their tenant if this rent debt is not paid. So here's some other details about SB 91, which is the law that gives tenants the ability to defer their rent debt. Number one, landlords can't apply security deposits to COVID-19 debt without written permission unless the tenants move out. Landlords cannot apply future rent payments to COVID-19 debt. They can't charge late fees or interest on COVID-19 debt, and they can't, start charging new or increased fees on services. Lastly, landlords can reduce services due to COVID-19 without reducing the rent if it's related to COVID-19. And I also want to emphasize that during this whole process, these months, if a landlord chooses to evict their tenant during this period of time, the landlord is basically saying, or under the law, the landlord will not be able to pursue any rent debt that is owed to them by that tenant. So this was about evictions and COVID-19. I'm going to talk a little bit about the state rental assistance that is now available to everybody in the state of California. So the state is offering rental assistance, and this is kind of a brief overview of who's eligible for this rent relief. So households that have an income under 80% of the area median income, households and individuals who've lost significant income or had financial hardship caused by COVID-19, and those who are at risk of losing their homes due to expenses related to COVID-19 for reasons like their rent is past due, utility bills, they have an eviction notice, etc. And it's also important to emphasize that citizenship status is not asked when you're applying for this rent relief. So you'll see here this little chart. It says LA County median income for different size households. This information is also available online, and I'll share that website with you briefly. So the COVID-19 rent relief that is being offered can be used for a lot of different purposes. Well, obviously, it can be used for any rental debt that you owe. Landlords can apply for 80% of rent debt through this program if they agree to forgive the remaining 20% that tenants owe them. Tenants can apply for 25% of their rent debt if the landlords won't participate. The rental relief can be used for future rent payments. And it can also be used for utility bills and also future utility bills. So if you want more information about applying and to apply now, you can go to housingiskey.com. This is administered through the state of California. Again, if you're looking for notices, forms, and more information, you can go to housingiskey.com. Eligible landlords and renters can now get help with unpaid rent, and you can give them a call to check your eligibility. I also want to emphasize that the rental assistance program, landlords are encouraged to apply first, and then say the landlord just doesn't want to apply at all, then it would open up for tenants to be able to go ahead and apply on their own. So these are just some local protections that are available to tenants during the COVID-19 crisis. And like I said, there are certain cities that have protections specific to them right now. Alhambra doesn't have city-specific protections, but because Alhambra is in LA County, Alhambra is covered under LA County's tenant protections. And I'm going to briefly talk about what those protections are that apply to people who live in Alhambra. So LA County has a variety of different eviction defenses that are available to tenants. These protections are set to expire at the end of June, but they may, be extended. So for example, tenants have a defense against no-fault evictions. No-fault evictions are basically evictions that are not the tenant's fault. So examples of it, the owner's moving in or moving their family in the unit, the owner's taking the unit off the rental market, the owner is ordered by the government to vacate the unit. This is a question I've gotten a lot over the past few months. I've had a lot of landlords in particular ask me, can I ask my tenant to move right now if I want to move back into the unit? Or I would like to move my family into the unit. And I have to tell them, if they're covered under LA County's eviction protections, that, well, you can try to do so, but your tenants do have a legal defense against that in court. They have a legal defense against no-fault evictions right now. Other eviction defenses include defenses against evictions based on unauthorized occupants and pets and nuisances. So these are usually seen as valid reasons for eviction. Having somebody who is usually not on the lease living there, usually a reason for eviction. But right now, this is protected in LA County. Also, pets that are not on the lease living there that are there because of the pandemic or pandemic related reasons are also not a reason to evict tenants during this period of time. And then lastly, we have a nuisance protection. So this was actually partly passed because a lot of people had their children at home or a lot more people in their home, and LA County wanted to protect tenants from being evicted for things like causing a lot of noise because there's more people in the home. And then lastly, tenants are protected from eviction for denying their landlord entry. So say that a lot of tenants have had concerns about their safety and their health, and they don't want to let their landlords or contractors into their unit. They are legally allowed to say, no, I don't want anybody to come to my unit right now, and the landlord will have to comply because that tenant has an eviction defense against that. So again, this is a LA County-wide protection. Some cities have specific protections, but because this Alhambra doesn't have city-specific protections at the moment, they are protected under these LA County protections, which are actually quite comprehensive. So I just talked about no-cause evictions. So like I said, no-cause evictions or no-fault evictions are not the tenant's fault. So for example, landlord wants to move back into unit, landlord wants to take the unit off the rental market, etc. There's another type of eviction called a just cause eviction. A just cause eviction means that there is a valid legal reason. Usually it means that there's a fault, that the tenant has done something to violate the lease or cause some type of serious violation that the landlord has to ask them to leave. So all tenants in California have just cause eviction protections until August. And this is important to emphasize because usually if you're not protected under a law that gives you just cause eviction protections, the landlord doesn't need any type of reason to evict you. They don't have to provide any legal reason. If you ask for a reason, they don't have to give you one. But right now until August, all tenants have just cause protections, meaning that if the landlord wants to evict you, they have to use specific reasons under the law. For example, lease violations, criminal activity, nuisance, which is covered right now by LA County, or these are just examples of what at-fault reasons can look like. So if you're in the city of Alhambra, then you're living in a unit that's covered by AB 1482, which is the law that I spoke about earlier when it comes to rent increases, then even after August, you'll be protected by just cause eviction protections. But if you live in a unit that's not covered under AB 1482, after August, then you won't be covered by just cause eviction protections. If this is confusing to you and you just want to speak to somebody about, what am I covered under? What kind of unit do I live in? I would encourage you to just reach out to us because a lot of the laws kind of intersect. They expire at different times. So it could be kind of confusing, but generally just know that right now your landlord needs a valid legal reason to evict you. And it can't be because they want to move back into the unit or take it off the rental market. And there is a legal aid resource called Stay Housed LA. And Stay Housed LA is basically a coalition of different community organizations that are offering free or low cost legal aid and community support. They have a pretty fast turnaround. This is specifically for people who've gotten an eviction notice. So if you do get an eviction notice, meaning papers from a court, it's usually a thick packet of papers, make sure you contact Stay Housed LA immediately to get in touch with an attorney. So that was my COVID part of the presentation. I just wanted to pause for a second to see if anybody had any questions, or if Sasha, if you had anything you want to say about that portion.
Thank you so much for that, Susan. I think that was a lot of extremely important information. So I'm not sure if you have folks with questions. Okay, so I see a hand raised. It's Stern Fan LA. So I'm going to go ahead and allow you to talk. So you can go ahead and unmute yourself now.
Yes, I had a question about the payback. It said June 30th, 2021, tenants should pay back at least 25% of the total due rent between September 1st of 2020 and June 30th, 2021. What about the amount that was due prior to September? Because it started in April.
Tenants don't have to. So tenants don't have to start paying. Say that you started owing rent in March, right? March 2020.
Yes.
Anything that you owe between March 2020 and September 2021. I'm sorry, I get the dates a little mixed up. I'm gonna go back to the slide. That rent debt that you owe you don't have to start paying it back until August. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but in the text it said the rent that was due between September 1st and June 30th. But this started prior to September 1st. So basically from when it started to June 30th, that's when we have to pay back at least 25% of total rent due.
So the law is a little confusing. In order to qualify for the protections, you just have to pay 25% of what you owe from September 2020 to June 2021. Any rent debt that you owe before September 2020, you don't have to start paying that back until August.
Okay, thank you very much.
Great, thank you for that question. So do we have anybody else that has any questions? I want to remind folks too that if you have a question, feel free to type anything into the chat. But I think for now, we'll go ahead and move forward. I know Susan wanted to touch on fair housing as well, so we'll move on to that next topic. But if any of you have burning questions that come up, feel free to type them in and we'll answer them at the end.
All right, thank you so much. So we're going to talk very briefly about fair housing. So we do have general fair housing presentations available as well, but I'm going to talk very quickly about what the Fair Housing Act is, how it applies to you, and what discrimination looks like. So the Fair Housing Act is basically a federal law that protects individuals from discrimination based on certain characteristics, things like what race they are, the color of their skin, what religion they practice, discrimination based on sex, national origin, discrimination, familial status, which basically means whether or not you have children, and then lastly, disability. These are federally protected characteristics. So in the entire United States, landlords are prohibited from treating somebody differently, applying different terms or treatments, etc., based on one of these characteristics. So in California, you have additional protections under the law. You have those federal protections and you have the state protections. So this includes things like marital status, whether or not you're married, your ancestry, your sexual orientation, your gender identity and expression, your source of income, medical condition, military veteran status, as well as genetic information. And if anybody wants a specific illustration of any of these characteristics or how they play out, I'm happy to do that as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about source of income. This is because this law changed a bit, or there was an addition to this law in 2019 when Section 8 became Section 8 became protected under the source of income law in California. So the source of income law basically means that landlords, managers, rental agents cannot deny applications or apply different terms, conditions, etc., based on a tenant's lawful source of income. And this includes any types of subsidies or financial aid that's paid to the tenant or the landlord. So for those that are not familiar, Section 8 is a program that's available through the county where those who qualify can get a voucher that subsidizes a portion of their rent. And for a very long time, Section 8 voucher holders were discriminated against or were denied housing purely on the basis of the fact that they have a Section 8 voucher. So now, starting in 2019, if you have a Section 8 voucher, then landlords are not allowed to flat out tell you that they don't want to rent to you because you have Section 8. So very briefly, housing providers cannot turn down an applicant because that person received Section 8. And it was a huge issue where landlords would basically, put a sign or put in their application process, they're like, Section 8 need not apply. So now that's illegal. You cannot have an ad that suggests or states that Section 8 won't be accepted. And then if you are a landlord and you would like to evict or ask a Section 8 tenant to vacate, you have to give that tenant a 90-day notice. There are a variety of different laws that offer tenants different types of protections in California. There's laws that protect survivors of domestic violence. We actually do have a entire presentation about domestic violence and sexual harassment in housing. That if you're interested, you can reach out to HRC. And we talk about the different laws that protect those who are, currently in a domestic violence case or are a survivor of domestic violence. There are also laws that protect those of different immigration or citizenship status in California from discrimination in housing. There are laws that protect individuals based on their primary language. So say that somebody's primary language isn't English. Through the law, landlords, if they are asked by a tenant or a prospective tenant to offer advertisements or a copy of the lease in a different language, then the landlord would have to provide that copy in whatever language that tenant wants if they are asked to. Landlords don't have to offer it up front, but if they are asked to do so, then they have to be able to provide it. Arbitrary reasons for discrimination. And then lastly, we have the Ralph Act, which protects individuals from hate crimes in housing. So the fair housing laws that I spoke about, they apply to basically all types of housing transactions and all types of residential dwellings. These are just some examples of prohibited practices. So, for example, you can't refuse to sell or rent housing to somebody based on the color of their skin or their race or the fact that they have a Section 8 voucher. You can't refuse to negotiate for the sale or rental of housing. Say that a landlord or a manager negotiates with, a young couple that doesn't have kids, but they don't want to negotiate with a single mom that has 2 kids. That would definitely be seen as, discrimination. You can't say that housing is unavailable when it is available. You can't apply different terms or rules. So maybe different terms or rules. We see this a lot with people with kids, that they'll have special rules that apply to them that don't apply to people who don't have kids in the building. Discrimination based on association, threatening, intimidating, harassing a tenant. Some examples that we've gotten, and unfortunately, we have seen different types of examples based on harassment based on race or even sexual harassment, just because people are home a lot more and they have to interact with, maybe their landlords in a way, or they're in situations where they're vulnerable to certain types of harassment and feel like they can't say anything in return because they have to be at home. Steering happens to people of all different groups, but we see it very often, again, with people who have kids, right? Maybe somebody with 2 kids goes to see a unit and they are encouraged by the manager or the agent to look somewhere else, which is better for kids. That would be considered steering. Discriminatory statements in advertising. So say an advertisement, very obvious example would be, no Section 8. That would be a discriminatory advertisement. Or even more innocuous examples like great Christian neighborhood or great for single professionals that could be seen as discriminatory statements in advertising. And then lastly, prohibited practices include a refusal to grant a reasonable accommodation or modification, which I'm going to talk about in 1 second. So I've talked a lot about the things that landlords can't do or what's prohibited. There are a lot of things that landlords can still use to vet a potential tenant. So this includes, landlords can still say, ask their tenant for a certain income level. They can ask for a certain credit score. They can ask for references from a previous landlord. And they can also say it's a smoke-free building, it's a pet-free building. And then they can also vet people by criminal history. But again, you see this little asterisk on screen. When you're vetting somebody on criminal history, make sure you take it case by case. Don't have a blanket statement that says that, anybody with any type of criminal history is not allowed to live here. This is just because criminal history can intersect with different types of characteristics, like race, for example. And then landlords are allowed to say that it's a pet-free building, but if somebody needs a service animal, which I'm going to talk about in a second, that's not a pet, and that person would be able to be allowed to have their service dog or whatever they need. Okay, let's talk about reasonable accommodations and modifications. There's a lot of text on screen, but I'm going to just reduce it down to what it is very simply. I get a lot of questions from people who are like, I need a service animal, but I live in a pet-free building. What do I do? Or I need this type of adjustment because I have a disability, a physical disability, a mental disability. What can I do? And what I basically tell them is, there is something under the law. It's a tool that you can use. It's called a reasonable accommodation or modification. And this is basically a special request that you can make if you're a tenant with a disability, mental or physical. You can request specific types of changes and exceptions. So for example, you live in a pet-free building, but you need your service dog. You're going to ask for an exception. And landlords can request verification of disabilities that are not readily apparent. And if a request creates an undue burden or fundamentally alters the nature of a business, then landlords, they can tell their tenant, I can't grant your specific request, but can we talk about what would be a good alternative? So some really common examples that I get are, for example, like I said, the pet issue, having a service animal, or sometimes tenants, for example, they live in a building where their neighbor smokes or something like that, and they have asthma. This is just an example. Then they would talk to their landlord, say, I really can't live in this unit. Can I live in a different unit on another floor or another side of the building? And these are all things that you can ask for as a tenant with a disability. These are some examples. So accommodations are changes to a rule or a policy. Big example, no pet building, but I need a service animal. That's a change to a rule or a policy. A modification is a physical change to a unit. So for example, you need to install a grab bar in the bathroom, or you need to change the carpet to a wood because you're in a wheelchair. Those are modifications, physical modifications. So some other examples of changes to rule or policies. Changing the rental due date, service animal, parking lot. Sometimes people need a parking space closer to the unit because they have a mobility issue. Transferring units, I gave an illustration of that just now. A caregiver. So some people need caregivers that are there a lot, maybe, most of the week, or, sometimes this caregiver has to stay overnight. Caregiver is not the same thing as a tenant, and you can't charge rent for a caregiver. And I also want to emphasize that you can't charge a tenant for their accommodations. So you can't charge a pet deposit on a service animal, for example. You can't charge rent for a tenant's caregiver. And lastly, here we have an example, which is that tenants can actually also request to end a lease early or extend time to vacate if that's necessary for whatever disability that they have. And then modifications, like I said, are physical modifications to a unit. I do want to emphasize that if you're asking for a physical change, you are responsible as the tenant to pay for that modification. The only exception is if you live in some type of building that has government funds to make it ADA compliant. Otherwise, if you live in like a privately owned building that doesn't have that type of funding, then you as the tenant are responsible for installation and de-installation. These are just some COVID-19 reminders. It's unlawful to discriminate based on race, nationality, or ethnicity. And it's also unlawful to discriminate based on disability. So housing providers can't just kick somebody out because that person has COVID or has been exposed to COVID. And they can't segregate people 65 plus to specific parts of the building, for example, to protect them from COVID or something like that. And that's the end of my presentation. Like I said, this is a lot of information, but I just encourage you to reach out to us. I can put my email in the chat and also our website and our phone number. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for that, Susan. So I want to go ahead and turn it over to our audience and see really quick if anyone has any questions that they would like to ask. If you are interested in asking a question and would like to speak, you can go ahead and raise your hand. The raise your hand option should appear. If you click on the bottom, click onto participants, something should come up. So you can raise your hand. The other option is for you to type any question into the Q&A box. That'll allow you to submit a question as well. So, for the time being, Susan, I have a couple of questions that I'd like to ask. So, for Section 8, I know you had mentioned that is now, it's statewide mandatory for landlords to accept Section 8 from tenants. And so, I was wondering, as a city, should we see advertisements being posted, by folks essentially saying that they're not going to accept Section 8? How should we approach that kind of issue? And I guess, if any of our residents listening to this call or maybe to see a posting that was advertising and saying that they weren't going to allow Section 8, how would they go about reporting that? Is there like maybe a place to do so, or how should that be handled?
If residents see that, or even tenants, prospective tenants, they can actually report it to, the Housing Rights Center. Just give us a call, send us an email about, where you saw it, if you can take a picture of it, so we can kind of gather that information. That's for people who are, we would really only able to, we do collect data on different buildings and different practices for management companies and stuff. So you can go ahead and report it to either us, or you can actually probably report it to a state agency, like the, actually, I want to double check which state agency that you would report that to. But yeah, if you see something, you can just report it to HRC.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful. And another question I had, I think that there are a number of our tenants that are residents, and I think tenants just across LA County that are very nervous about the expiration date that's coming quite soon, coming this summer. And I had seen that 80%, the state is offering to cover up to 80%, of rent if the landlord's willing to participate. But unfortunately, we have heard of cases, and I know tenants have shared with me cases in which their landlords don't want to accept it. I know you said that the state would offer 25% to a tenant, which is actually the first that I'd heard of that. So they'll be offering 25%, which is great. Is there any kind of assistance beyond that that's going to be available to tenants that you know of, or is the 25% just what's available, for the time being?
I think I would like to look into that a little bit more. I don't think that the state will only cover 25% of the tenant's rental debt. I believe that's if, the landlord, I believe that if the landlord just refuses to accept the rental debt that, or the rental relief, that a tenant can go ahead and apply and get all that rental relief that would be owed to the landlord. But I would like to check to see what that process looks like. And if there are, I believe there are consequences for landlords that refuse to take that rental assistance as well. But I would encourage anybody listening to just go on that website to check first, and to also have a conversation with your landlord about it. But I believe that the state is not only offering 25% of tenants' rental debt if tenants are applying. I believe that the state is covering more than that.
And you know, in terms of the program and signing up for it, I know you shared the website at housingiskey.com. So can folks begin signing up for that today? Let's say, you know, we have some residents on the line that wanted to sign up. Can they go ahead and apply and begin that application process? And in addition to that, are these funds going to be limited? Is there any sort of kind of pressure to do so immediately, or you know, is it okay maybe if someone is to apply later, or is this something we should really be pushing folks to take advantage of now?
I would do it as soon as possible, just because, you know, there is an expiration date for state legislation coming up, and we're going to see like a lot of people applying for it in the next few months. So if you know that you have a need now, just go ahead and do it. Yeah.
And if someone needed help with completing that application, could we go ahead and send someone, you know, over your way? Would you be able to assist them with that process?
We can help people begin their application process, but like I said, it's managed through the state. So we don't know, or I personally don't know the full extent of what the application process looks like. If this is something folks are interested in, we can put out some more specific information through HRC's platforms about what the process looks like. And there are actually community organizations that are offering help to individuals that need help with the process. I think the resource is actually on the Housing is Key website. They're asking for like volunteers to sign up to guide people through the process. So I can look at that website again to send you that specific link.
Great, yeah, that would be really helpful. I know, especially for us here in Alhambra, one of the issues we often run into is, you know, residents that are dealing with language barriers and other residents that might need help understanding kind of like the legalese or some of the questions that they're being asked, and some guidance through the process. So that's really helpful to know, and so I can communicate to the rest of my council members as well. Great. Well, it seems like we don't have any more questions, so I guess we'll go ahead and wrap up. But you know, Susan, I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to come out to present today. All the information that you shared was so incredibly important, so incredibly useful. We did record this session today for anyone that's still watching and maybe wants to rewind back and rewatch, or maybe wants to share this with a friend, a family member. So you can go ahead and do that. We'll upload it to YouTube. And you know, for all of you interested in contacting the Housing Rights Center, please, you know, reach out to them. Their information's listed there up on the screen, and Susan's always been really great at responding and getting back to us. So
Okay. Thank you so much, everybody.
thank you. Well, have a good evening, everyone. And if you need to reach me or have any questions, feel free to reach out to myself if you have any other outstanding questions about this presentation. If not, you can reach out to the Housing Rights Center as well. Okay. Have a good night. Bye.